Laporta's status has been changed from questionable to out. Not a good start. McCaffrey's out. Ugh, it's getting worse. Hill now too? Ugh, what a week. Zoo Crew, welcome back for our next topic. Today we're going to talk about fantasy football and what I'm going to call the reverse Madden, turning injuries on in fantasy football. So let's see what's in store. Welcome to the Zoo Crew. So let's start way back in the beginning. At the beginning of the 1960s, we turned to Stratomatic Baseball, basically a board game that allowed fans to draft players, set lineups, and simulate games based on real-life statistics. It came out with a whole bunch of cards, it had real players in it, it had their actual statistics, and you somehow turned it into a game and see who would win. I don't know. Hey, it was a great early start into what would become fantasy sports. Now, the real credit for the real beginning of fantasy sports is in 1980 when the Rotisserie Baseball League formed in New York in the Rotisserie restaurant, for which it was named, set up a scoring system based on player stats. And originally it was a 4x4 categories: average, home runs, RBI, and steals. And for pitchers, wins, saves, ERA, and WHIP, which is walks plus hits per innings pitched, which they made up themselves. Pretty groundbreaking at the time. Now, fantasy baseball would expand to be more standard with a 5x5 scoring system that included runs for batters and strikeouts for pitchers. So rotisserie baseball was a season-long scoring, so there was no weekly anything. You just gained points throughout the season. You know, you got, say, 10 points if you were the best in batting average for the entire season, and you got 1 point if your team was the worst in batting average for the season, and so on and so forth. And the team with the most total points at the end of the season was the winner. Now, before the season started, you drafted players, and you were allowed to trade players with the other teams, or you could add and drop players throughout the season. Pretty much what we know as fantasy baseball as it was. So we talk about fantasy baseball here because it was the real start of popularity in fantasy sports. And baseball remained the primary fantasy sport all the way up until, say, 1994, when we had the baseball strike, when football really started to take over. So let's give credit where credit is due. In just around the same time as Stratomatic Baseball, in 1962, the Greater Oakland Professional Pigskin Prognosticators League was first founded by Bill Winkenbaugh, who was a part owner of the Oakland Raiders. And he did this amongst his friends and even spread it to his local bar that he was the owner of, and it showed some real promise there. However, fantasy football was very slow to take off, which is why the fantasy baseball iteration in 1980 was normally considered to be the true beginning of fantasy sports. So for fantasy football and for fantasy baseball, in the early years, players kept track of stats and scores manually. It was very labor intensive, with calculations being done by hand and requiring communication through phone calls or in-person meetings. I don't know about you, I don't see how anyone would be doing that in these days, but thank goodness in the 1990s the internet came along and revolutionized fantasy football and baseball by providing platforms for online league management and player tracking. Now, CBS Sports was the first to have fantasy football available online in 1997, and ESPN and Yahoo joined shortly thereafter in 1999. So, fantasy sports today has exploded, and you can see all of the stats there Most notably, we have 50.4 million people in the US alone as of 2022 participating in some form of fantasy sports, and 79% of those players play fantasy football. Now you can see that the next most popular now is basketball at 32%. Very surprising that basketball has passed baseball in popularity for fantasy sports. And you can see, as an industry, fantasy sports are now an $11 billion industry worldwide and valued at $8.8 billion in the US alone in 2021. So let's get into the basics of fantasy football, just in case you're not one of those 50+ million people playing it. You have a general lineup consisting of your starters and a bench. Your starters include 1 quarterback, 2 running backs, 2 wide receivers, 1 tight end, 1 flex position, which typically is either a running back, wide receiver, or tight end, a kicker, and a defense and special teams. They're combined into 1 unit. And then a bench of either 6 or 7 players that can be any of those above mentioned positions. Plus, many leagues now also offer an injured reserve, where you can stash 1 or 2 players who are injured, just like in real football, while they are hurt, and then you can return them to the active roster once they are healthy. Fantasy football scoring now originally started known as standard scoring, and more recently a new form called PPR, or points per reception, has really taken off. ESPN a few years ago was the leader in the trend of making points per reception their primary scoring system. And as it makes obvious sense, anyone who catches a pass gets 1 point merely for catching the ball, even if you catch it for negative yards. So that's a way to just have more fun getting more points into the league, because people like to score more points. So there you have it. PPR is now the primary tool on many fantasy sites. The traditional scoring, your standard scoring, you gain points per yards or points per touchdown, but you don't get a point per reception. So specific to that, passing, you usually get 1 point per 25 yards and 4 points for a passing touchdown. Now for rushing and receiving, you'll receive 1 point for every 10 yards and 6 points per touchdown. You can gain points or lose points depending on what you do, based on fumbles, interceptions, sacks, etc. So let's talk about your roster and how you add or subtract players. Every week there's typically a waiver period or a FAB budget that you bid on players. Free agent auction budget is what FAB stands for. This typically happens early in the week, a couple days after the end of the Monday Night Football game. I would say most normally this happens on a Wednesday morning. And then after the waiver/FAB period ends, free agency happens. Anyone that's left, you can add them, but obviously when you then typically have to drop a player off of your current roster. And of course, trades. Everyone loves trades if you can make them happen. Trades can happen anytime throughout the week. You get your new players, and your old players go to the other team, obviously. There's typically a trade deadline, just like you would see in any normal professional sport. And we also briefly mentioned on IR, now players with an IR designation or usually an out designation, they may be moved to an open IR spot, but then they will need to be moved out of the IR spot if they no longer have either of those designations and you want to make another move. So your roster, you have your starters and you have your bench. You are able to interchange players between your starting lineup and the bench all the way up until each individual's game time. So if you have a player starting at 1 o'clock, they can be moved from the bench into the starting lineup up until their game starts. Once the game starts, then their spot is locked and you can no longer move them. Same thing, a player at a Sunday Night Football game at 8 o'clock, they would be able to be moved throughout the day during the 1 and 4 o'clock games, but once their 8 o'clock game starts, they're locked. So why do we talk about all this, and why do we call this the reverse Madden? Well, let's talk about Madden NFL Football for a little bit, and there's last year's cover athlete, Josh Allen, in the background. So John Madden Football debuted in 1988 on the Apple II series of computers, being called the first real football simulation because they were able to get 11-on-11 football in the game. In fact, even though the makers of the game had said to John Madden that there's no way you can get all 22 players on the field at one time, John Madden refused to release the game unless they were able to get all 11 players from each side onto the field at once, saying it had to be real football. And so obviously from there it was a hit. The rest is history. It's become one of the most successful sports franchises in history, either second or third. It was a little hard to figure out. On Wikipedia, it looks like FIFA is clearing away the #1 sports franchise. Now between NBA 2K and Madden, one of those is #2, one of those is #3. On Wikipedia, it looked like 2K was a little bit ahead, but their data seemed to be a lot more recent. It looked like they went up to 2023 records there, where the Madden records only seem to be through 2018. So it's very possible that Madden is actually #2. I guess we just can't know for sure. But ever since 1990, what we can say is that Madden NFL Football has been released on one or more consoles every single year up through right now, and it'll still come out with Madden NFL 2025 this year. Now, coincidentally enough, for its 25th anniversary, Madden NFL 25 came out several years ago, but usually they call it Madden NFL blank for the year, just 24. You can see this, the most recent version, so I think they'll have to say 2025 this year for the upcoming release. Madden NFL Football has many customizable settings that try to replicate the play of NFL football as much as possible, but the user is able to do the exact opposite if they don't want to do that and make it as wacky and arcadey as they could possibly want, just to have more fun. And one way that this is done is through what they call sliders, which are typically on a 0 to 100 scale. You can increase or decrease sliders on all sorts of attributes in the game to make it however you want to make it. And one of the most notable of these is called the injury slider, where sliding it all the way to 0 disables injuries, and increasing it all the way to 100 will make everyone pretty much into broken glass by the end of the game. So you can see here, our slide, we nicely have it circled by GameSpot here. They did this for us that I just happened to find. Here's the injuries moved to 0 on the slider. It's starting at 0 all the way to 100. Now, mind you, if you look just above the injuries, you can see other attributes here just have an on or off. And this is where I came up with the idea. So, reverse Madden, turning injuries on. Madden NFL 2001 was the first Madden to add injury sliders. So before Madden NFL 2000, which is our graphic here, amazing how different it looks, what 24 years can do to graphics. It was just an on-off toggle, so that's where I got the idea. You could turn injuries off if you didn't want to have to deal with your star players getting injured in the game and having to deal with a backup. If you've ever played fantasy football, you know that feeling where you get that notification on your phone that it says someone has now picked up an injury status, going from healthy to questionable or questionable to out. And at the time you see out, you know your week very well might be finished, and there's just no coming back. So what if we turned injuries on and allowed your bench players to automatically be inserted into your lineups? So let's lay the ground rules for this particular idea. In the pregame, your starting lineup is set just as it always is. However, your bench players is where we start to see the big difference. Now, your bench must be placed in the order you want them to enter the game as a substitute. So the bench will no longer just be 6 guys in any random order. They're going to be labeled bench 1, bench 2, bench 3, bench 4, bench 5, bench 6. Before the game starts, you need to set your bench in the order that you want them to enter the game in case of an injury. Now, during the game, as always, players will lock into their lineup or bench spot at the start of their game. Now, this is most notable that a player who we're going to say is BN3, bench 3 here, at game time, they're locked into bench 3. They can't be moved down to bench 5. So they're locked as soon as their game starts. Injured players are automatically replaced with the first bench player who shares their position once they have missed a quarter of football. Now, the start time of a player's game does not impact his ability to replace an injured player in the lineup. So if your player has a 1 o'clock game and gets injured in that game, a player who plays on Monday Night Football, they're still able to enter the game for them. It doesn't really matter when their start time is. Injuries. Now let's go into a little more depth on injuries. A player is considered to be injured and will be replaced when two things happen. One, he receives an in-game injury designation, and two, he misses an entire quarter completely. Now, the in-game injury designation, that's that notification that you get on your phone. Your starting player is going to have no injury designation at the start of a game. But if he gets injured and has to come out, you're going to get that ding. It's going to pop up a Q for questionable for him to come back. And then if he's ruled out for the entire game, that Q, you're going to get another ding, and it'll go from Q to O, and he'll be ruled out. So for our purposes, it doesn't matter if he's changed from Q to O. It just matters that he has any injury designation. It could be questionable, doubtful, or out. Now, let's talk about missing an entire quarter. Now, we don't need complete precision on this. We just need it to be close enough to replicate replacing people on the bench for substitutes. If Deontay Johnson gets injured with 2:30 to go in the second quarter, we're not necessarily going to replace him with, say, Marquise Brown at 2:29 to go in his game of the second quarter. We don't need to be quite that precise here. We're going to say, starting in the third quarter, if Deontay doesn't return, Marquise's stats will start beginning in the third quarter and then also in the fourth quarter. However, if a player misses an entire quarter, but then later returns to the game, the starter will also automatically re-enter and his stats will start up again in that quarter, and your bench player will then go back to the bench. And you'll see that here in a little more depth once we get to our example. So here it is. Here is our two-team fantasy league roster. And this is our basic stats. We've got starters at QB, 2 running backs, 2 receivers, a tight end, a flex, a kicker, a defense and special teams, and then we have 6 bench players. And you can see I've color-coded it so that quarterbacks are light blue, running backs are green, wide receivers are dark blue, tight ends are yellow, kickers are some sort of pinkish color, and defenses are purple. So let's take a more in-depth look here. Pre-game Thursday, our action is to move the bench players into the order that you want them to enter the game. So you can see here that we've changed the order of the players in our bench. Now if we go back, you can see here that we didn't have them in any particular order. It was just based on their position, how they were ordered. But Thursday, we've now changed them to the order that we want them to enter the game should someone get injured. So based on this, we think Jamar Chase is the best player on our bench. Let's now go to Thursday before the game. You see here, we've set a fake game time for each player here. We have Detroit playing on Thursday night, and we have 2 Lions on our team. Our starting tight end is Sam Laporta, and a backup wide receiver is Amon-Ra St. Brown. So, in our fake game here, we're turning up the injury slider to 100 here. We're gonna knock out a whole bunch of people in this week so we can get a big example of everything that could possibly happen. So, in this example, Laporta gets off to a really fast start, a big touchdown catch. He gets 60 yards and a touchdown in the first quarter, giving him 12 points for the first quarter. In the second quarter, he gets 1 catch, which is for 10 yards, but he gets injured on that play. So you can see we've turned him from yellow to orange for getting injured in the second quarter. He unfortunately is unable to return for the rest of the game, so he has now been moved to out on his injury designation, and for our purposes, I've colored this in red. Now, Amon-Ra, he had a kind of a slow first half as Laporta was the one leading the charge, but he completely took over in the second half, and he had 50 receiving yards of his own for 5 points in the third quarter, and then another 50 receiving yards and a touchdown for 11 fantasy points, giving him 18 total points for the game. Now, I will mention this is a standard scoring league, so it is as simple as possible. We're not having any points per reception, and I'm not even going to deal with partial points, No one's going to have, say, 62 yards in the first quarter, so to get 6.2 points for yardage, we're just going to go strictly full points, as simple as possible. So what we have here, move starters and bench spots to the exact location that we talked about earlier, which we did pregame. But note here, St. Brown is now locked at bench 3 for the entire week. When his game started, he was still at bench 3, so he cannot be moved for the entire weekend. Now we can move Chase and Taylor down to bench 4 or bench 5 or bench 6 if we want to, but if we did, we would have to move one of these 3 players up to bench 1 or bench 2 to replace them. But St. Brown will be bench 3 no matter what. So let's get to Sunday at 1 p.m. I decided not to make any changes to the starting lineup or to the order of the bench here. So we had our 1 p.m. games, notably Josh Allen, Breece Hall, Mark Andrews, both our Baltimore kicker and defense, Jamar Chase, Bijan Robinson, and Mark Andrews all played at 1 o'clock on Sunday. And that is pretty much how you'll see it every Sunday. The most players play at 1 o'clock. Now for our purposes, we're going to focus on 2 people in particular here. First, I want to talk about Josh Allen. You can see here he had a nice first quarter with 50 passing yards and 10 rushing yards, but he got injured, fumbled and lost the ball, so he ended up only getting 1 fantasy point for the first quarter. But when he fumbled, he got hurt, and he was unable to return for the second quarter. So you can see he's been moved to red here. But after halftime, there was some magic going on in the locker room, and all of a sudden he was healthy enough to return, and he had a pretty good second half, and he ended the game with 19 total points. Similarly, Breece Hall, we'll touch on it. I'm going to say here he got injured in the first quarter, so maybe you got that notification that he was moved from healthy to questionable, but he was able to return at some point during the second quarter, even if it was only for 1 play. That doesn't matter. He returned in the second quarter, and he ended up with 30 yards apparently. So he does not have any missed injury time, even though he was given an injury designation. So no one from your bench comes in to take his place. He's good to go for all 4 quarters for our purposes. So the other player I want to focus on here is Mark Andrews. So we know he was our second tight end, and we also know that Laporta was injured in the second quarter, so he missed the entire second half. So what we do here for tight end, this is a tight end, so we first look at flex. He's a wide receiver, so we don't deal with that. And then we go down our bench here, and there's no one in the first 4 bench spots that qualify for tight end, but Mark Andrews is our backup tight end here, so his stats from the first and second quarters do not count. That's why they're in this darker shade of red. They don't count, but his third and fourth quarter points, he got 20 yards in each quarter. So his 4 total points here do count for your team in this situation. So instead of only being stuck with 13 points out of your tight end, you get 17 total points out of your tight end spot for the week. Pretty good deal. So let's go to the beginning of the 4 o'clock games. And the same thing is going to take place here. Let's talk about our quarterbacks first again, because they're at the top. Remember, we had Josh Allen got injured and missed the entire second quarter. So we go down to our bench, and we do have a backup quarterback, which is Jalen Hurts. In our situation, he played 3 quarters and got injured at some point in the third quarter and missed the fourth quarter. But for our purposes, he wasn't starting anyways, so there's nothing to worry about for scoring-wise for him in the fourth quarter. But we do know that Josh Allen was injured in the first quarter of his game and missed the entire second quarter. So we are able to move Jalen Hurts up into the lineup to take Allen's place for the second quarter, and therefore we get Hurts' 50 passing yards, touchdown, and an interception for 5 points for the second quarter. So instead of just getting Allen's 19 points, we also get to count Hurts' 5 points from the second quarter only to give your quarterback spot 24 points. And also from the 4 o'clock game, Christian McCaffrey, he was of course a monster as always. He had a huge first half with 20 fantasy points that included 2 touchdowns, but early in the third quarter, he had 10 rushing yards, 10 receiving yards, but got hurt and could not return for the remainder of the game. So we now have an injury spot here for the fourth quarter. Let's go to our rundown here. We first look at flex, that's a receiver. We go to our bench. Our first running back here is Jonathan Taylor of the Colts. He's not yet played, so we're not even going to consider moving anyone into McCaffrey's spot for the fourth quarter now. Bijan Robinson has already played, but we're not going to do anything with him because he may or may not get into the game here for this particular spot. So now the 8 o'clock game has been played, had 2 players in it. First, we had Jonathan Taylor of the Colts. He was on our bench way down here, and he was able to play the entire game without an issue. And we also had Tyreek Hill, our starting receiver, and he had an amazing touchdown, 40 yards and a TD, but apparently he must have pulled his hamstring on that play at the end of the run to get that touchdown, and he missed the entire rest of the game. So we need a backup for 3 straight quarters for him. So the first thing we do is we start with flex. We see that Jefferson is a wide receiver, so we're going to bump him up from flex into one of the wide receiver spots to replace Hill. He counts in the flex spot for the first quarter, but starting in the second quarter, he now goes to wide receiver. So for the rest of this game, his points will count in the wide receiver spot. So we need to move someone into the flex spot. Our very first person on the bench that is any flex position is Jamar Chase, who also is a receiver, obviously. He played at 1 o'clock, but that doesn't matter for our purposes. His first quarter points don't count. That's why they're in the dark red. But starting in the second quarter, any points he got for the rest of the game count for that flex spot, and he's now got 4 points for the rest of the game in the flex spot. Now for Taylor, he's our second bench spot and the first running back that was available. So for now, you can see his first 3 quarters don't count for anything, and his fourth quarter takes the place of McCaffrey, and he had a nice 30 yards and a touchdown in the fourth quarter, giving 9 points. So just out of the McCaffrey spot, we got 22 and 9 for 31 whopping points in a standard scoring league. Pretty amazing. That's what it's all about, getting more points into your fantasy roster. And this also includes what we would have pregame Monday. We still have CeeDee Lamb to go on Monday Night Football. So let's see how it goes for CeeDee. And he gets injured in the second quarter after a 20-yard catch, and he is out for the rest of the game. So unfortunately, he ends with 3 points. But we're going to do some more maneuvering in our fantasy spots here. So we're going to have to do a lot here. So we had Jefferson already moving to wide receiver starting in the second quarter. So starting in the third quarter, we had Chase in the flex spot, but now he is going to move up into the second wide receiver spot that was held by Lamb, and he will no longer be flex for the third and fourth quarters. He'll now be receiver. So for Chase, he has nothing counting in the first quarter. He counts as flex for the second quarter, and he counts as a receiver for the third and fourth quarter. So now we need a flex spot for the third and the fourth quarter. So on our bench, after Chase, is Taylor. Now we already talked about Taylor going to running back for the fourth quarter, but we need to worry about the third quarter first. So your real-time scoring could see some changes going on throughout the day and throughout the couple days, including Monday night. So Taylor, he will not count as anything for the first and second quarter, but starting in the third quarter, he's going to take Chase's spot when Chase goes to receiver, and he'll be now in the flex spot for the third quarter. But we now have to reaccount for McCaffrey's injury in the fourth quarter, and of course, he is indeed a running back, so he's not going to stay at flex. He will move up to that McCaffrey running spot still. And now we'll have to go down to our next bench spot, which is St. Brown, who played all the way back on Thursday. And amazingly, we're pretty excited about St. Brown coming into the lineup because his fourth quarter was 50 yards and a touchdown. So he got us 11 big points in the fourth quarter. So maybe we didn't expect St. Brown to ever take the field for us because he was bench 3. But because of all these injuries, we somehow got an amazing benefit out of this, and we might actually just win the game because we get St. Brown's 11 big points in the fourth quarter. So you can see that there's a dynamic movement from quarter to quarter, and as the days go along, to get you to your ultimate score. And for this case, we tallied it all up. Our lineup, our starting lineup, now has 158 points, and only 39 points are left on the bench. Let's compare this to what your fantasy score would be under today's normal rules without any injury switches. Here, you set your starter and that's it. You just see what happens. Nothing wrong with that, but I guess it's just fine. It's not all the additional excitement going on. So you lose Josh Allen's second quarter, you lose McCaffrey's fourth quarter, you lose Lamb's third and fourth quarter, and you lose Laporta's third and fourth quarter. So you drop from 158 points down to 122 points. That's 36 total points lost from a total of 9 quarters missed. Now, will you usually lose 5 players in 9 quarters in a given week? No, but even losing 1 player for a quarter or 2 or 3, that could really just ruin your week and cost you a game. So by doing this, this keeps you in the game, and if you've managed your team well enough and have a good bench, you very well could come away with a win that you otherwise would have lost. So what this essentially will do is cause a quarter by quarter analysis of your roster. So the first time we looked through this, that was, in real time while you're watching the games Thursday night, Sunday all day, and then Monday night. Here, we're basically going to take a step back and see what's happening on a quarter by quarter fantasy basis without any regard for the actual start times of the game. So for the first quarter, we're looking at it just like you would for any fantasy league going on right now. All of your starters are in for the first quarter. They just get all of their points as they always would. The second quarter is where things get interesting. Here we had Allen and Hill get injured. So we had Hurts replace Allen, and we have Jefferson moving from flex to receiver, and we have Chase moving from bench to flex. Then in our third quarter, we have Allen returning. So now Hurts goes back to the bench, but now we also have Laporta injured, and the first player on our bench, who's qualified at tight end, obviously is Andrews. He moves in from the bench to tight end starting in the third quarter. Now we go to our fourth and final quarter of the game. Allen still is at the game. It doesn't matter that Hurts actually got injured. He was on the bench again anyways. So wide receivers didn't change at all for these purposes, but running back McCaffrey is now out and injured. So again, Taylor moves from flex to running back to take his place, and St. Brown at bench 3 moves up into that flex spot and gathers points for the fourth quarter. And after all this, Robinson is our only player from the bench not to get in at all. So that's our general analysis of how the injuries will work. Now, of course, this opens us up to several possible loopholes in the rules that we're going to need to try to fix to get this to work on a week-to-week basis. The first loophole that we're going to tackle is based on tight end. We know on Thursday night we had Sam Laporta getting injured in the second quarter and not returning for the rest of the game. So we're going to look at this the same as we would prior to the start of games on Sunday at 1 o'clock. In this scenario, we're going to make one change. Instead of having Andrews as our backup tight end here, we're not going to have any backup tight end at all. Instead, we picked up another running back, Kyren Williams of the Rams. He is now in Andrews' previous spot of bench 5. So you can see here, we know Laporta is injured. So what do? We know if we pick up a tight end, we can gather some points for the third and fourth quarter, but we don't have a tight end. So do we drop Williams from our lineup to get some tight end that's available throughout the week? Or are we going to roll the dice and say tight ends don't score that many points in general, and we're just going to let it go with Laporta's 13 points? That's probably better than you would expect out of a tight end anyways. It was a great week. We might only get those 4 points that we saw Andrew get. And maybe Andrews isn't available because he's amazing. Maybe, let's look at the schedule here. Dallas plays Monday night. Maybe Jake Ferguson's the best tight end available off of the free agent market. And we say, Ferguson in a half. Maybe he'll get 2 or 3 points. Not worth dropping Kyron Williams to pick up Jake Ferguson. We're going to go with it. But that's the type of roster decision that we want to have. So our decision here, we're going to let this go. We're going to say there's no issue with this potential loophole. This is a good roster decision management decision that we have to make. And, do you drop a player that you thought was more valuable for a chance at points in 1 to 3 quarters? In this case, it was 2 quarters. It may or may not be worth it for you. So we want to allow hard decisions to be made from Thursday night into Sunday. So that's a good problem to have. We want to let this go. Loophole number 2, we will again stick with our tight end scenario here. Here we're showing you the slide as of the beginning of the 4 o'clock game. So the 1 o'clock games are finished. The 4 o'clock games are about to start. We now know that Andrews has completed his 1 o'clock game. The 4 o'clock game started at 4:05 or 4:25. So you've got a couple minutes here in between regardless. Andrews has completed his game. He got 5 total points, but we know that he'll count for 4 points if we just let it ride and let him go into the lineup. So what do we want to do here? We see we do have Taylor is bench number 2. He's not played yet. And we know that he will automatically be slotted into bench 2 and therefore will go ahead of Andrews. So if we don't think those 4 points that Andrews got are enough, we could pick up Jake Ferguson and say maybe he'll get a touchdown in the second half and we'll get 9 points out of Ferguson's half of the game, and that'll be what puts us over to the top to get the win. If we do that, it also opens up the opportunity, should wide receivers get injured, to allow St. Brown, who has 18 total points, to get into the lineup more quickly. So again, we don't know if Hill, Lamb, or Jefferson are going to get injured. So if we want to do whatever we can to get St. Brown into the lineup, we want to knock out a flex spot, which is Taylor, and then we could put in that tight end there. They'll go into the tight end spot first, keeping the flex spot open because St. Brown is ahead of Andrews there. So he'll get in after Chase as the second flex option, essentially. As you can see that we're trying to game the system here a little bit to get to St. Brown's second half. There was 16 big points so that he can get into the lineup. So is this a good problem to have? Yes. Here we're going to let it go again, just like in Frozen. And we're going to say, yes, this is another good roster decision we want managers to be allowed to make throughout the day, essentially. And if they really want to pick up a tight end that they otherwise wouldn't have on their roster for a better player that they did like as a running back, well, they're welcome to do that. And, in a deeper than one team league, I don't think you're going to see Jonathan Taylor on too many benches. So it might be less painful to drop someone off of your bench to pick up a tight end to go for that. However, also, you might not have Travis Kelce available as the third tight end to be the one to pick up, and you'll be stuck with Jake Ferguson or someone, much further down the rankings to put into that spot. Our third loophole, we're now going to switch our focus to the quarterbacks, and we're going to make one big change here. Jalen Hurts no longer has a Sunday at 4 o'clock game. He has a bye this week. So you can see I've moved him down. He's no longer as bench 6. He's now in a separate spot. Remember at the beginning of the talk we said buys would be completely separated from the rest of the bench, but if you're just on a bye, you don't get that additional bench spot. If this were an IR spot, you would be able to put Hurts on IR and then get an additional bench 6. But for a bye, as it is right now in fantasy football, you do not get an extra bench spot. So this week we just have 5 bench spots and then Hurts on a bye. So the 4 o'clock games here have been completed, and here's what we know. Josh Allen was injured in the first quarter. He missed all of the second quarter, but returned for the second half. So you've got the second quarter where you can get points out of whatever any quarterback would do in that second quarter. So again, here we look at our bench. Jonathan Taylor has not yet played. Do we want to drop Taylor to pick up a quarterback to go into bench 2 for just 1 quarter's worth of points. We know that quarterback, whoever it may be, is not going to get points. If it's a 1-team league, yeah, we can pick up Patrick Mahomes and put him in. He'll probably get 2 touchdowns in that quarter. If it's a deeper league, maybe we've got one of the rookies. Maybe Caleb Williams is available. So who knows? It's hard to say. But is dropping Taylor to pick up any quarterback before the 8 o'clock game start, is that worth it? I don't know. That's a decision you have to make. Now, similarly, I put a note here that for a player that's stashed on IR, we would have a bench 6 person. Let's say this is before the 4 o'clock game start, so Hurts is playing at 4 o'clock. He's been on IR. We didn't make any roster changes, so even though he's not hurt anymore, would we be able to move Hurts from IR into the active roster after the 1 o'clock games and before his game starts at 4 o'clock, now that we know he will be able to get points for the second quarter? That's a similar loophole that we need to talk about. So, what's our solution for this? First, for the bench player, we're going to let it go. Again, another good roster management decision that you can make. It's up to the manager to decide if you want to drop that player that you thought was more valuable for a chance of points for the 1 to 3 quarters. So again, if we want to drop Taylor and just pick up a random quarterback that's available to get points out of the second quarter, we can do that. Now, in our specific example, for a player on a bye, what we're going to change now about fantasy rosters is we will now lock a player on a bye when the 1 o'clock games start. Right now, they never really lock at all. So you can typically replace them at any time and pick up anyone that's not on a bye to take their spot on the bench and then potentially move them on. But we're not going to allow that anymore because they're separate. Here we want to protect some scoring here, and we're going to lock all bye players at 1 o'clock on a Sunday. So if you want to drop a player that's on bye, you've got to drop them before the start of the 1 o'clock games, or else, it makes it too easy maybe to drop someone who's on a bye to pick someone else up and kind of manipulate the scoring off of your bench. A player that's been on IR, they need to be activated to the 53-man roster by 4 o'clock p.m. on the day before the game. So you'll see now that a player that's been IR, they've been practicing for a couple of weeks, you've got to add them to the active roster within 3 weeks. If they're going to play on Sunday, they need to be activated to the active roster at that deadline. It's a Saturday at 4 o'clock. We're fantasy here. We're not looking at things at 4 o'clock on a Saturday night. We're going to wait until just before game time. So you get up until 1 o'clock when the games start to decide whether you're going to activate the player off of the IR. And again, in this case, at 1 o'clock, we don't yet know whether Allen will get injured or not. So you're just adding Hurts to the active roster as the insurance in case Allen gets injured. All right, our next loophole, we're going to move to the running backs. And here we're going to reuse the slide for Sunday prior to the start of the Sunday at 8 o'clock games. So what we know at the conclusion of the 4 o'clock games is now that McCaffrey was injured and he missed the entire fourth quarter. And again, Taylor has not yet played his Sunday night game. It's about to start. But what we do know is that Breece Hall completed his game without incident. And we know that Robinson, even though we've barely talked about him, he had a pretty good game. He didn't get a touchdown, but he got a 120 combined yards of rushing and receiving for 12 fantasy points. So again, we're left with the situation. So do we drop Taylor for a quarterback, kicker, or defense, or even drop him for no one at all so that we can make sure that Robinson's fourth quarter gets points, his 4 points get added. Maybe we think 4 points is a good score for 1 quarter and we want to add those 4 points. We don't want to take a chance of Taylor getting, say, 1 point in the fourth quarter. Maybe the game's that close. 3-point difference might make all of the difference between winning and losing at that point. And, a Sunday night game, there's only 2 games left in the week most of the time. We will pretty much know at that point if the 4 points that Robinson got will make the difference. It also continues the factor of if we drop Taylor for a quarterback, kicker, defense, or no one at all, that'll move up the chance of St. Brown getting into the game because again, we still have Hill and Lamb left, and if both receivers go down, St. Brown would then go into the lineup in the flex spot. So the difference here, let's go to our solution. We're going to make some additional rules to try to prevent this. So in this example, we cannot drop Taylor and add no one. We're going to say bench 2 must be filled. So the new rule is anytime that someone is dropped, you must be accompanied with an add. Now, unless, of course, there's an IR activation, then if you're moving someone from IR onto the bench, you can only have 6 bench spots, so someone has to get dropped without someone else being added. That just makes sense. Of course, you could have a person going off of IR and onto IR at the same time. No one gets added or dropped in that situation. Likewise, if you're placing a player on IR, you must either remove someone else from IR or add someone from free agency without dropping them. You're not allowed to move someone to IR unless you also add someone off of free agency. And you see the additional note regarding waivers and fab. We're not going to worry about that here, but note it's an additional rule, similar with our trade discussion below. But for today, you can read that separately. We're not going to talk about it. But we will talk about the second additional rule. At least 5 of the 6 bench spots, which includes players on a bye, must be held by a flex player, being, again, running back, wide receiver, or tight end. In this example, you cannot drop Taylor to pick up this inconsequential quarterback, kicker, or DST. And note, however, that someone who has all 6 bench spots with a flex player, they would still be able to get away with it and make this type of move, but we just can't cover all scenarios here. But I think having a backup quarterback under this scenario is really going to be important. I mean, any quarterback can pick up the most fantasy points. So if you lose Josh Allen in the first quarter and he doesn't come back for the second half, if you only get 1 quarter's worth of points for a quarterback, you're in really bad shape for that week. So I think almost every fantasy roster is going to have a backup quarterback for sure as insurance. So I think that's why we want to set the base of at least 5 bench spots for the flex spot, basically leaving 1 bench spot for a quarterback. If there's a bye for a quarterback, kicker, or defense or special teams, we're going to allow for a second bench spot to account for that bye, but it will only be 1 additional spot. We're not going to allow any less than 4 flex players. So if you have both quarterbacks, kicker, and defense all on a bye, we're not going to allow for only 2 flex players and 4 non-flex players. We're still going to keep it at 4 flex players and 2 non-flex players. So you're going to be forced to do some dropping of these bye players or defenses. So I don't want to go too overboard on that, but I think this is the best we can do to prevent a little bit of excessive roster manipulation. And why are we saying this? I think this is, different from those first 3 loophole scenarios that we talked about. Those were all scenarios where the newly added player served a good faith purpose to gain points for your fantasy team. Even if it may have helped improve getting points off of the bench, that's all right. There was still a good faith purpose for that newly acquired player to gain points. But in the final scenario that we just talked about, it was really a bad faith move, that it was solely done to manipulate scoring from your bench, to move the bench players up to get them points. I mean, you already knew what they did, and so you wanted to get those bench players into the game if at all possible. So that's not really what we're going for, because that's not real football-ish. I mean, you don't know that your backup's going to come in and do better than your starter when a player gets hurt for real. So the best we could do there to avoid that were those 2 rules that we added in. And I kind of rewrote those here in this slide as well. We can take a look at that. So there's our difference from the prior situations to this particular situation. So one final loophole that we want to talk about is the pregame or game day designations, as you will. So in this case, we're going to talk about our flex spot. Here, we've put Justin Jefferson, who we've barely talked about, but he had an amazing week in all those prior scenarios because he's amazing, and it's ridiculous that he's the 3rd rated wide receiver and has to be in our flex spot here. In this case, either, all the way throughout the week, maybe he didn't practice the whole week, was ruled out early in the week, or he was questionable the entire week, and actives and inactives are named 90 minutes before the start of their game. So in this case, it's a 4 o'clock kickoff. It'd be, basically a 2:30 time to know whether a player is active or inactive. So in this case, Jefferson was ruled out. If he had played, we would have wanted to keep him in because he's Justin Jefferson, but we left him in as long as we could. But when that actives and inactives came out, he was ruled out, so now we need to do something here. So, going into the 4 o'clock games, we now know that Jefferson is out, and we know that Chase has already scored 8 points from the conclusion of the 1 o'clock games. Now, 8 points is pretty decent, and in a 12-team league, 8 points as your bench player number 1 would probably be pretty good. In this particular league, it's maybe not so great. So know your league, I guess, and how many points you're going to get. So here our question is, do we leave Jefferson in and manipulate our points? And so Chase automatically comes into the flex spot for 8 points, which again would move St. Brown up to potentially get his 18 points later in the game. Or do we roll the dice and put Taylor into the lineup, he's the only man left, and put him into flex spot 1? Here's our solution. Additional rule. Any player with a game day designation of out or IR must be moved to the bench or the IR prior to the start of his game, or that player will earn the team 0 points and no substitution from the bench will be allowed. Now, you're saying, well, that doesn't seem fair. All the substitutions otherwise for these players getting hurt in-game automatically get bumped up in this situation. Well, this is how fantasy works right now, essentially, so we're going to not change it. You've got to pay attention to your lineup. You can't just leave Justin Jefferson in all week, even if he's ruled out on Tuesday. And it is preventing you from getting 2 bites at the apple for Jamar Chase. So you can't keep Jefferson in the lineup all the way until 4 o'clock and then decide whether I want Chase's 8 points or do I want to roll the dice with Taylor and maybe he'll get more than 8 points and we can just move him in quickly at 4 o'clock. Now, an accompanying rule, any player with a game day designation of out or IR on the bench will be skipped when inserting substitutes into the lineup. So if you are paying attention to your lineup and you want to start Jefferson like we talked about, but he's had that questionable listing all week, and then when actives and inactives come out, he is on the inactive list. Now we've got to do what we do in any fantasy league. We've got to take him out here at the last minute and put someone else into the flex spot. So in this case, we would need to insert Taylor into the flex spot in order to gain any points at all. But because all of our bench spots are locked at 1 o'clock, like we talked about, the bench 1 through bench 6, they're locked. 1 through 6. We can't move the order. So Jefferson, we can't move Jefferson all the way down to bench 6 and move everybody else up 1. Jefferson's going to go into bench 2. But you're not going to be penalized for having Jefferson in bench 2 because you wanted to play Jefferson. It just didn't work out. He was ruled out 90 minutes before the kickoff. So Taylor's going to be your starter at the flex. The first injury to either wide receiver or flex is going to be Chase. The second one's going to skip Jefferson at bench 2, and it'll go to bench 3 for St. Brown. That simple. You're not going to be penalized for hoping that your player that you want in is actually going to play when he doesn't play. So there we go. I think we've covered most of the loopholes. I'm sure there are a few things I didn't think about that might pop up, but let's talk about it. Is it worth it at the end of the day to make this change? So here's our list of pros. You get additional strategy to order your bench players correctly. And you have additional strategy on how to assemble your bench. So I think one of the things with fantasy that you miss out, you just have some guys on the bench. Or do you want the Steelers' third wide receiver on your bench, or do you want the Packers' third wide receiver on your bench? It's a toss-up. Who really knows? Do you need that extra quarterback every week to have on your bench to take up more of those spots so in case of an injury, you'll get some points out of it? So, and then ordering your bench players correctly, right now you're just tossing guys onto the bench. In this situation, you get to think, you get to put them in order how you want them. couple additional strategy decisions. We like to add the strategy when it's not done nefariously. These are 2 good strategy decisions that I think will help positively impact fantasy football. Our third pro, players entering games due to injury are done automatically. So there is no additional effort or time commitment to keep track of your roster during the games. So again, Josh Allen didn't play in the second quarter, came back in the third quarter. What did you have to do? Nothing. You didn't have to be paying attention on your phone or watching the Red Zone channel, so you're paying attention to every single game going on at one time to know when these players are getting injured and coming back. You don't have to deal with it. You can set it and forget it, go away, do something with your family and not watch football at all. The guys will come in off the bench and they'll be substituted in the order that you already told them to do when you logged off at 12:59, and they'll be good to go. Our third pro, this is more realistic to real football. In real football, yeah, guys come in off the bench. They get to play. You're not playing 10 on 11 when your wide receiver gets injured. You actually get to put in a backup wide receiver. Funny how that works. So here, you get your backup to actually come in and play. It actually puts a focus on making sure you have a good bench, that you're paying attention to all the players in the NFL, well, fantasy players in the NFL, and make sure you have the best players available for your bench. Next, there's just more points. Again, whether it's PPR or standard or a half-point PPR or anything else, you get more points by having players come in off the bench. Again, we talked about it. ESPN and others have moved to these PPR leagues so that there's more fun in the game by getting more points. Here, there's more fun in the game by getting more points by having backups actually get points, which ties into the final pro. Your week is not over immediately as soon as your superstar is injured. If Josh Allen is injured in the first quarter, you're done. You thought he was going to get 25 to 30 points. Instead, he's got 5 points, and you're done. That's it. You've lost 20 points or more, and your week's over. Sayonara. Hopefully you've got a good backup quarterback for next week, or maybe your whole season's over. Who knows? But here, at least, you may still have a chance for the week and win it by getting points out of your backup quarterback. So any week is not immediately abandoned by injuries to your best players. Of course, there are some cons, so we'll bring them up. Here's what I was able to come up with. First, the real-time scoring may not be as precise due to shifting starters. So, we kind of talked about it. People are moving from flex into wide receiver, flex into running back. Times are switching around, so the CPU is going to know well enough to put somebody in. It may not necessarily be the way things work out at the end of the day. All in all, I think it'll work out pretty much as it always would, normal scoring, but there may be some periods where your scoring's a little bit off from what you're going to see as a final score. I don't think that's a big deal. But if you're really into real-time scoring, there may be some slight variances until you get to the end of the week, and then we have that true quarter-by-quarter scoring that we went through in the second go-round. Secondly, you need in-game injury reports to be accurate. Now, honestly, for the most part, I don't think that's a big problem. On your phone, you get that ding and you see these in-game injury reports. That happens all the time. As soon as someone goes to that blue tent, you're getting an injury report. There may be a delay, but I don't think it'll matter. I don't think there'll be such a delay that we won't hit both of the criteria for any individual injury. You're going to know when a player goes on an injury report. It might be a little bit delayed, but it'll come out. It'll happen. Eventually you'll get that update from the sideline reporter and you'll get that ding on your phone and you'll be good to go. And obviously you'll know pretty much right away whether a player plays at all in a quarter. You may not know personally if a player got injured on the next to last play of the first quarter. Maybe you're not so sure that they are actually injured until midway through the second quarter. But that's something the CPU will have worked out. They'll know, the snap counts will be on there. There's a whole bunch of sites that do that already. I'm pretty sure the fantasy site can handle that. I don't think there'll be any issues. If a player misses a whole quarter, I think it'll eventually be taken care of if it's not done nearly simultaneously. Our third con, you and me may occasionally be cheering for injuries to players so that a higher scoring player that's on your bench is added to the lineup. I do have a feeling the NFL is not going to like this particular part of the game. In our situation, we know it was Amon-Ra St. Brown. He had the huge second half, 18 total points for the game. You're going to say, man, can I just have a couple little nicks and dings where a guy's going to not play for the fourth quarter? And Amon-Ra's big fourth quarter can count for my team. It doesn't sound right. You don't want to cheer for injuries. Now, it is your own team's players. You don't want them to be hurt long term. So I don't know if that's such a smart thing to hope for that. Psychologically, I can see how that's a negative, and I'm sure the NFL won't really be keen into that. So I guess that's a true negative. Lastly, this doesn't fix the Bijan Robinson case that happened last year. If you don't remember it, in October of 2023, he apparently was sick. He got sick the night before the game. He still suited up for the game. He was available for the entire game, but since he wasn't feeling well, he played very sparingly. He normally played over 60% of the snaps. Obviously he's so good, he was a top 5 running back for my situation. In that game, he played 1 snap in the first quarter. He played 3 total snaps at halftime, and then by the end of the game he had played 11 total snaps and only received 1 carry for 3 yards that he got near the very end of the fourth quarter. This entire time he had no injury designation and he played in every quarter. So even though you expected Bijan to be your normal first round player self when you started him with confidence that day, you ended up getting 0.3 points for the day? Yikes. What a rough one. That was tough. That is not going to be fixed here. I don't think there's anything we can do to assuage that situation. No one even knew he was sick until during the game, an in-game interview, I guess, with the head coach, Arthur Smith, now with the Steelers, as an offensive coordinator, that he was sick, and that was why he was playing so little throughout the game. That was my last con. I guess I should also add that previous scenario that we talked about in length, where it is possible, even with the rules that I put in, that you can do some roster manipulation to add a fake quarterback, kicker, or defense to try to move up players from your bench to get some points in that one scenario. But all in all, I don't think that's enough to overcome all the pros and make a more exciting fantasy game for everyone, make that bench more important, get them some points, just more fun for everyone, more competitive, and an overall improvement for fantasy football. Now, we called this Reverse Madden. I wanted to go back. I looked way back at early Madden days, and I was reminded of the Madden Ambulance. So I had to look at this, and I want everyone to take a look, and let's go into this very short here. So thank you Gammatroid for this. Watch out for the ambulance. Here goes Dan Marino in Madden 92, not known for his running. Oh my goodness, he somehow got 7 yards, but he's injured. Oh! The ambulance just ran over half the team! Oh my lord! How is this in the game? How is this in the game? Madden 92, folks. The ambulance running dudes over. To save one guy, they're gonna run over half the team. Oh, that's amazing. That's amazing. All right, folks, so with that trip to the hospital for these many players that they're going to need, that's our show, and thank you for joining the SportsZu.